Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis. Continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. I got back from, speaking of cultures of consciousness, I got back from Azora recently, a kind of neo-tribal psychedelic underground festival in Hungary, which was a wonderful time. Not just a fun party in a very beautiful place with lots of wonderful structures, but the speaker series that I was a part of at Chambrook House, which is the area in the festival where people give talks. It's the oldest structure on the property, a really remarkable old farmhouse converted to a lecture space. It was particularly entertaining and rewarding, having been at these sort of festival lecture spaces for quite a long time. I was very impressed, not just with the way it was run, but really the sense that even in these kind of marginal, non-academic, festival, experiential contexts, that the discourse around not just psychedelics, but also the place of consciousness in the modern world, how to stay awake and alive, and tuned in our current contemporary chaos, that all these languages and discussions have been just getting better and better. So I was really confirmed in my gut feeling that while scholarship in academia is very important, that a lot of the real action is happening in these more interstices, these places in between, these kind of nomad zones where interdisciplinary thinkers come together and share their hard-earned lore. Speaking of sort of psychedelic discussions and discourses, I did want to mention that I'll be at the Cultural and Political Perspectives on Psychedelic Science Symposium, which is coming up in just about a week or so at the California Institute of Integral Studies here in San Francisco. It's sponsored by Chacruna and the East-West Psychology Department at CIIS, put together by Bia Labachi, who's been on Expanding Mind in the past, and I'm just going to be moderating a panel. I'm not talking, although I'm sure I'll ask some pesky questions. I feel like it's actually going to be a bit of a sparkly conversation there. I think there might be some loggerheads, some clangs and clings. We'll report back after the event. We're going to be talking with David Nichols, who's one of the conference presenters, but we'll be having our conversation after the festival. So, after the symposium. So there's already a theme here, which is about the way that conversations around psychedelics, around plant medicines, really around the way in which human beings have come to alter their bodies and their consciousness through plants and medicines and compounds, how these discussions occur both inside and outside of academia. And one of the strongest evidences I've had in my life for the power of learning and the excellence of scholarship outside of the official domains of academia has been my experience of the ethnobotanists I've been blessed to meet in my life. I'm not much of a green thumb. I'm an urban dweller. I don't know if I could grow a broccoli. I don't know. But for whatever reason, I've actually wound up being very good friends with a number of remarkable ethnobotanists, none of whom have university degrees, and all of whom are not only experts in their field, but for me, like paragons of interdisciplinary intellectual work, where science, history, natural history, visionary experience, poetry, anthropology, ethnography, all come together, are woven together, not as one thing, but as a space within which we move, and we move in some very positive and very productive ways. This is all wisdom that needs to be getting out more and more these days, of course, for all number of reasons we don't have to go into. Anyway, today we're going to be talking to one of these ethnobotanists, Dale Millard. I hope I pronounce your last name right, Dale. And Dale's he's from South Africa. He's been doing this stuff for a very long time, traveling the world, exploring, doing research, doing primary research, and then also working with communities to develop ethnobotanical gardens for medicines, and working with a lot of indigenous healers. And so we'll be hearing some of these stories and just talking about some of his ethnobotanical research, particularly into some of the healing properties of ayahuasca, something we don't hear about so much because everyone's so gunning for the visions. With no further ado, Dale, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Good afternoon, Erik.
Good to hear from you. Hey, so I'm actually just kind of curious. I don't know that much about your history. I know that you didn't come to being an ethnobotanist in a sort of linear way of getting a certain degree and blah blah blah. There's a lot of different things that have flowed into it. But what was happening in your life at the point where you realized that that term and that kind of practice and that way of dealing with plants and people was really becoming, one of the dominant themes in your life? I mean, when did you become, in your own mind, an ethnobotanist?
Well, it's quite a strange story. I have a background in herpetology, which is, for those who don't know, the study of reptiles. And for many years, I was a curator of a reptile research institute in South Africa. And in my role there, I was the assistant to a German professor who used to come to South Africa, a toxicologist known as Michael Ziegler. And it was my job to take him around the country looking for all these venomous creatures that we would catch. And then he'd extract the venom from them. And as a lot of people probably know, venoms are very important in terms of drug development. So it was after a couple of years ago, looking at reptiles and specifically at something called protein toxicology, I went to live in a valley in South Africa, which was adjacent to one of the traditional ancestral valleys in South Africa. And it was at that time that I met a lot of the traditional healers living up there. And through what they were doing, I became very interested in medicinal plants and learning all that I could about them.
So it kind of it was partly an encounter with the traditional healers themselves. I mean, that's one of the remarkable things about ethnobotany is that it takes indigenous wisdom or traditional wisdom or local village knowledge very seriously, both as a source of science and a source of natural history of specific information about particular plants, what they're good for, what they're not good for. But it's also embedded in this kind of in a much broader worldview that's not the normal worldview of a typical scientist or biologist or even natural historian. So for you, how much of this journey has been about not just falling in love with plants and wanting to know more about plants and what they're good for and what their chemistry is and how the chemistry works with our chemistry, but also a kind of journey into very much older ways than modern science of living in a world of plants and a world of psychoactive and healing medicines?
Well, we are kind of at the point where we are realizing that through mechanistic scientific approaches, we don't know everything. And if we start looking at some of the knowledge that these traditional healers have, it's obvious to me anyway that they have different ways of learning or different ways of knowing things. And I think it's time that we take what these people say seriously. There's many examples I can think of where we've actually missed out, where we've taken what these healers tell us at face value and and have ignored what they're saying as more as folkloric. And then we discover that what they meant was quite literal. So yes, being exposed to traditional healers throughout the world, I've come to learn that there are different ways of learning about nature and different ways of being sensitive to the very many lessons that nature has to share.
Can you tell me a story about one of your encounters? Some a healer or medicine figure who was particularly interesting for you, or you really learned a lot about that whole the combination of pragmatic real world knowledge and other modes of knowing and being in the world. Is there some person that kind of stands out in your memory?
Yes, I must first say, that when I first got exposed to traditional healing, it was through the sangomas, who are the traditional healers of South Africa. And I literally wandered into their sacred valley because it was adjacent to my valley. And I knew very little about these people. I grew up in South Africa in the times of apartheid. So, the traditional healers were ostracized as being witches and were accused of being involved in witchcraft. And they got a very, very bad rap. But I think also because of apartheid, a lot of this kind of knowledge got forced into a kind of secrecy and not open to everyone. So it was about 20 years ago. Now I wandered into what is called Maltse Ancestral Valley, which is kind of a pilgrimage site for a lot of the traditional healers of Southern Africa. And it was there I met a woman called Nontobeko Magenganani, who we called Monica, her English name for short. And she was one of what is known as the Mandao prophets of the Zulus. Okay, these are a group of sangomas that do their trance states in water and not on land. And the reason being is that the states that they go into are quite catatonic, and if you try to do them on land, a person gets thrown about and they can injure themselves. So they are a specific sect of sangomas that go into water and into trance and then go underwater, and they come out. And so this woman, Monica, played a very important role in my life in explaining a lot of this very weird and strange stuff to me. And I think she also helped me in my personal spiritual development in life. But so I would say she was kind of like my spiritual mum in all of this weird stuff.
That's wonderful. And once you got on into this stuff, it sounds like it really took you around the world. I mean, I know you've lived in Indonesia, you've done work in Brazil, you've done work in the Amazon. You've moved around a lot. Talk about some of the projects you've done. I mean, I know that in some cases you've actually gone into communities and helped people sort of create gardens for ethnobotanical substances, plants, healing herbs, etc., and really working with locals to revive some of these traditions. Can you talk about one of these explorations you did?
Sure. Well, the main focus of my work over this years is really, I didn't want to be an ethnobotanist that would go into traditional cultures, research their knowledge and record it without giving anything back. I regard this kind of knowledge as incredibly precious, especially to the people who benefit from it. But so what I ended up doing over the years, and I worked through a couple of NGOs that did this kind of work, is I would go into communities, research the common primary healthcare problems that they have, whether it be malaria or whether it be waterborne diseases or sexually transmitted infections. And in third world countries, you often find that the problems that people are encountering are often the same. So once you have a list of the primary healthcare problems that people suffer from, you can then look at chemistry in plants that might be able to help with this situation. So the first thing that is very important is to look at plants that have, or plant chemistry that have very broad safety profiles, because especially when you dealing with language barriers and things, you can't make a mistake that somebody could poison themselves. So basically, if you look at plants that are very, very safe, plants that have very broad spectrum chemistry, and I'll explain this in a second because this is important. Many of the plants that you find used medicinally are used for many, many different medical conditions. And this differs quite a bit from what we find in Western medicine, where most of our medicines are target-based, where we use one specific chemical against a specific disease or problem. But with plants, they contain many, many different chemicals, and that is why they are potentially useful for so many different conditions. So what you find in all the main medicinal systems throughout the world, whether they be Chinese medicine or Ayurveda or African medicine, you find these central plants that seem to be useful for a myriad of problems. And the rationale is because that they have very broad spectrum chemicals. So what I discovered, if you look at the plants that modulate immune function in humans, which is one of my interests, these plants, which are found in practically all cultures that have used medicinal plants, have very broad spectrum effects in terms of the kind of diseases that they're able to influence. And the reason being is that the impact is directly on the immune system. But to try and simplify that, what you could do is you could go into community and you could look at all their diseases, whether it be malaria, whether it be typhoid, and you could find a group of maybe 10 to 20 plants which you could teach people to grow, and that would give them some kind of solutions in terms of helping when these problems arise.
Well, one of the interesting things about what you're mentioning is this the fact that both the broad spectrum chemistry of some plants and the fact that some target the immune system helps explain the range of maladies that plants can treat. Because from, again, growing up in a Western culture where you have targeted medicine, this particular molecule is targeted at this particular complaint, and then you come across more traditional claims for whatever, osteophytida or whatever, that's like, okay, it can do this and this and this and this, it's good with cancer, it's good with this, and you're like, what? I mean, how could it touch so many things? But what you're saying is that's in a way kind of what makes a plant different than a modern industrial medicine is, or at least sometimes, that there's such a broad range, and sometimes that the immune system itself, which is this kind of meta system that's able to deal with so many different maladies, that those are the things that are being targeted. So it gives it a lot more, makes a lot more sense to me when you put it that way.
Well, it gives a medicine that works directly in the immune system. Those kind of medicines are the broadest spectrum of all, because all our diseases have some kind of impact on the immune level. But when we look at target-based medicine, it's been our research paradigm that we isolate one chemical and then we test that chemical for various particular kinds of effects. Now, the reasons that they do that is, as I mentioned, it's our research paradigm, but it's also because of profit, because, they hope to eventually find one magic molecule, which then they can hopefully synthesize and produce a whole lot of drugs based on that target molecule. But the problem is, nature is living and it evolves. So when you have one molecule, as we have already found out in allopathic medicine, you get resistance. So, all cancers become resistant over time to single molecules. So do viruses and so do bacteria. And the problem is they do it rather quickly. Whereas in our current drug development paradigm, it takes 10 years of researching in animals and in humans to develop one specific drug against a specific organism. So a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm a fan of whole plant medicine, particularly because I believe that you get a much better synergistic effect of using many chemicals together than you get from these monodrug therapies. And I might just also add that, resistance is something that is strictly isolated to Western medicine. In Ayurvedic medicine or Chinese medicine, as far as we know, or in traditional medicine, we don't know of any organism that becomes resistant to plants. And resistance is a growing problem in Western medicine.
Oh, that's fascinating. I hadn't thought about that. Just it's almost like nature has network effects because of its complexity, and that makes it difficult to study from a Western perspective because you can't isolate particular causes. I mean, we see this even today with cannabis. People trying to figure out where exactly do the healing properties of cannabis come from? How do we actually treat it? And there's a tension in the cannabis research community between those who believe that we should be studying the whole plant with the synergistic effects, knowing that it increases the complexity, and those that basically want to have piles of isolated white powders that have been extracted from cannabis and can be used to target specific things. And it's a very interesting paradigm because it's happening inside of the research. So you have researchers who are Western trained, they have that mechanistic model, but they're still saying, but to really do right by this plant as a medicine, we have to look at it in its complexity, even though that makes our job harder.
It makes our job a lot harder, but it makes it much more interesting. It gives a much broader array of effects. If you look at cannabis, most people know about THC or tetrahydrocannabinol, and that's supposedly the main chemical in cannabis that would get you high. But that's not true because there's many other chemicals in cannabis that are now known, to produce a variety of effects. The flavonols, for example, also add to the psychoactive effects. So, this mono drug thing to me is a bit simplistic. The foods that we eat contain many, many, many chemicals, and they have physiological effects in our bodies.
Yeah, the Airwoods, Earth and Fire, where they always like to say that we're on drugs all the time because once you recognize that food has psychophysiological effects, psychoactive effects, as well as this broad range of physiological responses, medical responses. Once you embrace food that way, which is of course a healthy way to deal with food because it helps you prioritize things that are better for you and to recognize that while that deep fried donut is delicious and sometimes the most appropriate thing to eat at that given time, that overall it may not be the best medicine. So once you kind of adopt that framework where we're swimming in drugs all the time, it's not like there's a specific point where a drug enters our system. Then you kind of open up to it seems to me a much broader way of thinking about the role that plants and other medicines play in our lives, which is sort of seems to be part of what the messages that some of these healers have. I mean, having worked with traditional healers, what are some things that people have said about the plant world or about medicine or about healing that are different than a Western model, but that you've really taken to heart, that have really stayed with you as a important way of thinking about both the science and the larger context of healing medicines, plant medicines?
Well, firstly, the approach of most of these people, most of these traditional healers, well, firstly, they mostly all come from animistic backgrounds. Okay, which means that they believe that nature is alive, and plants themselves operate. Plants themselves have their own spirits. And when you look at how some of these healers come to acquiring their information, don't necessarily expect rational answers. Often a healer would say to you, "Oh, well, the spirits told me," or and we as Westerners, we regard these things as kind of strange. But I believe, this is exactly what happens. Somehow these people have a sensitivity to being able to translate these kind of signals from nature, whether it be the spirits or whatever, but they have a way of interpreting, whether it be the patterns or the subtleties of nature, that they can derive useful meaning from.
And it clearly has been.
Made any sense?
Yeah, of course, no. And I mean, it's also been inspiring to you. I mean, you in a way. I mean, partly because of the path that your own knowledge, your own science, your own exploration, your own practices have taken you, which is not the conventional way through Western medicine or getting even a university degree, but being out in the field, and yet you have an extraordinary knowledge of the chemistry and the Western taxonomy and natural history. So in a way, you kind of have approached almost the some of the similar intuitions, but from the other side, where you've also seen the limits of Western models and how this more intuitive realm or animist realm actually has something to say to you too, or to other people who are coming from a more Western background, even if it takes a different form or maybe has a different language. So in what ways would you say that as an ethnobotanist, you also have some element of, let's say, animism in the way in which you think about things? Would that be fair to say?
Definitely. I think it's useful to try and make the best of both worlds. So, if I go into traditional culture, for example, and I find a plant that I know that they've been using for 4,000 years, I've seen it work. I know it works. I don't necessarily need the academic studies to back it up, but it's useful to have both those points of view. A lot of the plants that are used in the Amazon and other places are quite deadly poisonous, and they need extreme skill in order to use them in a way that is not safe, not dangerous. So when I would encounter a plant like that, I would like to know the toxicology studies of it.
Yeah, I would say so. Thinking about this whole idea of plants as spirits from a Western perspective, of course, one thing that's happening now and that has been happening, strongly, visibly, even from the mainstream world over the last 10 years or so has been the rise of Western interest in ayahuasca, which is, of course, a wonderful example of a very complex, very broad spectrum chemistry compound that is used for healing as well as for the visionary properties that is what mostly draws Westerners. But it's very interesting because you have, there must be, hundreds of thousands of examples now of people who come more or less from a Western background. They're not necessarily that aware of anthropology or the history of animism or what does it mean to think about things as plants as being alive, and yet they go through these experiences. On the other end, they come out and they're like, the spirit of ayahuasca told me this, and da-da-da. There's this weird inroad of animism around ayahuasca. And since I know you've done some really wonderful research on ayahuasca that's not what I've read, it's not the kind of stuff I normally hear about. even among scientific researchers, segue into talking about your interest in ayahuasca, and particularly from these angles that we've already been talking about, broad spectrum healing effects, what's going on scientifically, chemically inside the brew, that and what kind of things, that suggestions that you've seen of healing capacities, and then also the fact that I think there's no way to engage ayahuasca without engaging the kind of animist worldview, to say it loosely, that this material has been embedded in for thousands of years.
One of the things about ayahuasca, now that it's become a global phenomenon, is, people take it all over the world, mainly for these kind of epic experiences or life-changing experiences that it might be able to provide. And certainly it is a very valuable tool for that. But in my research, what I became very interested in is how little we have looked at how the Indians in the Amazon have been using ayahuasca and for what purposes. And it's known that ayahuasca is used for practically everything in the Amazon. It's been recorded being used in hunting. It's been recorded being used in the past in war. It's recorded being used in childbirth. But it's also well documented to be used in the treatment of many physiological ailments. And when I looked at the research as to the kind of ailments that ayahuasca treats, I found in the entire writings of ayahuasca maybe 4 scant references to ayahuasca being used as a physiological medicine, and those were mostly for things like parasites.
So, we hear a lot about ayahuasca as a visionary plant or visionary compound, compound of many plants, but less about it as a medicine. I mean, and so can you talk about that aspect of the brew?
Again, if you go and you look at the traditional use of ayahuasca in the Amazon, we find that ayahuasca is used for practically everything. And it's also used to produce these strong visionary experiences, which I kind of think the Western world became totally captivated without really looking at the physiological properties of ayahuasca. And if you look at the chemistry of ayahuasca is essentially made from 2 plants. One is a large jungle vine called Banisteriopsis carpi, mixed with the leaves of a member of the coffee family, Psychotria viridis, which contains the DMT component, which is the visionary component. But if you look especially at some of the alkaloids which are found in the vine, we find that these alkaloids, known as beta-carbolines, have very, very extensive and broad spectrum physiological effects. I mean, I, in my studies, looked at one of these alkaloids called harmine. Now, in a cup of ayahuasca, the most common alkaloid, it's 44% on average of the total of a cup of ayahuasca. This alkaloid harmine has very, very broad spectrum effects. It has strong antimicrobial properties. It kills certain viruses, bacteria, and fungi. It has very exciting anti-diabetic properties. It makes you more sensitive to insulin. And in a study that was done in rats, it even showed that it was able to regrow some of the pancreatic beta cells, which are damaged in type 1 diabetics. It's also known to have strong anti-cancer properties. Both harmine and tetrahydroharmine found in ayahuasca have very potent antidepressant effects. Harmine also has been shown to be anabolic to bone. So, it can help in repairing broken bones. It's very helpful in conditions like osteoporosis. It's even chondrogenic. It helps with the outgrowth of cartilage. So it's very useful in diseases like arthritis.
And now, how well, how much is this is kind of new research? I mean, have people been looking at harmine for a long time? Has there been sort of a rash of studies more recently, partly because of the sort of celebrity of ayahuasca and the vine?
Well, both. We've been looking at harmine. We first became aware of, some of the physiological properties of harmine, which was then called banisterine in 1928. But since then, a lot of the focus on harmine has been focused mainly on its psychological effects. And I would say it's only really in the last 15 years that people have become very aware of the broad spectrum physiological effects. And there's been a recent surge in interest, especially out of China and out of Japan. The Chinese are studying a lot into harmine at the moment.
That's fascinating. I did want to ask just a little bit about the psychological effects, just because there's so much discourse in the psychedelic world about DMT and the sort of like boilerplate elevator pitch for ayahuasca is like, yeah, well the vine lets you sort of engage an orally active form of DMT, and that's really what's going on. But of course, the vine does have its own psychological or spiritual properties that have, to some extent, not been as acknowledged as much. So even before we talk about the physiological effects, what are the psychological aspects of harmine and harmaline?
Most people, when they look at ayahuasca, tend to believe that the visionary aspects of ayahuasca come solely from the DMT plant, which is facilitated to become systemically active by the vine, which contains the MOA inhibitors. But those MOA inhibitors, like harmine and tetrahydroharmine, are psychoactive on their own. If you take enough of a brew of just the vine component, you will find that it makes you very wobbly on your legs. So it affects balance. It's very responsible for a component of the visions. Harmine on its own produces visions which are very watery and have a fluidity to the way they move. So to think that the DMT is the only psychoactive component of ayahuasca is totally incorrect. I mean, if you look at another plant called Paganum harmala, or Syrian rue, which some of the listeners might be aware of, that is the psychoactive compound which produces the red color used in Persian carpets. Now, if you ever wanted to know where they got their inspiration for the design of those carpets, it comes from Syrian rue, which contains a closely related compound, harmaline, which is found in smaller amounts in the ayahuasca brew.
That's fascinating, and I never thought about the connection with the visionary patterns of the carpets because Syrian rue is used so widely, and it's traditionally thrown into the fire. I mean, it's a very important part of that whole culture. One question I've always been wanted to ask someone who knows what they're talking about is like what as a class, what are beta carbolines? What purpose do they serve? Where do we see them? what's that? Because I've always find it easier to understand natural chemistry by kind of understanding the class of things that are in the things are in, and sort of how they work broadly, and then talking about specific examples like harmine or harmaline. So, what are carbolines?
Beta carbolines are a group of alkaloids which are derived from tryptophan. Okay, and they have the classical beta carboline ring in their structure. So, plants produce these various secondary metabolites. Some of them are alkaloids. Now, it's not proven, but it's believed that these alkaloids occur in plants and animals to help them adapt to stresses, whether it be ultraviolet light stress or temperature stress, or, some of them are very bitter, so they help the plant escape predation. But we don't really know. But what we do know is that beta carbolines are very widespread in nature. I mean, they're in your coffee, they're in your beer, they're in your passion fruit. But they are also increasingly being discovered in human beings. We have various beta carbolines in us, many of which the function is totally poorly understood. I mean, there's a crazy example. When you get cataracts in your eyes, it's been discovered that these 3 beta carbolines, which are very similar to harmine, which is the main beta carboline found in ayahuasca, 3 of these harmine-like beta carbolines suddenly pitch up in the lens of your eye, and they try and help reverse the process of crystallization. So there we can see that they potentially have a healing response in the body. But, not all beta carbolines are good. One of the beta carbolines, called tetrahydroharmine, is detected in the body round about the time of your headache after a heavy night's drinking. So the body converts some of alcohol into tetrahydroharmine. And so that's thought to be a bit of a neurotoxic beta carboline. So they are to answer your question, they are a very, very large group of alkaloids that are found throughout nature. I believe they are very broad spectrum in their function, both in the body and in nature. An interesting example is, the prototype chemical beta carboline, which is called norharmine, is the stuff that covers scorpions. And I don't know if you've ever seen a scorpion under ultraviolet light.
No.
It glows. It becomes very fluorescent. And so why a scorpion would be covered in something that fluoresces in UV light is anybody's guess. But to me, scorpions are involved in these very elaborate mating dances. And they do it in blackness of night. So it potentially helps their mates, it potentially helps them to find each other for mating, which in a broader sense is, a kind of signaling. And then we see in the body that beta carbolines are involved in various signaling processes in the body. But to answer your questions, we don't really know what beta carbolines do in nature.
No, that's fascinating. That's a really, really interesting question, especially that whole role of signaling. I mean, we kind of our natural, or I don't say natural, but just like our human centric mode is to go, yes, humans have language. Clearly, higher mammals, they signal to each other. But even though, but once you kind of take that sort of prejudice away, you realize that nature's signaling all the time, that it's growing and changing and eating and digesting, and all of that's happening. But there's also just signaling happening, all over the place. And it seems like there's a connection in some ways, or maybe there is, I'm not sure, between that signaling function and then some of these healing properties as well?
I think so, because firstly, as I mentioned, many of these beta carbolines that we're talking about are endogenous. So they're found in our bodies. And if something is occurring in the body, it must be there for a function. We can see with harmine in that it's very anabolic to bone. And as I mentioned, very good for osteoporosis and arthritis and those bones and joint diseases. But its effects in these diseases is it modulates something called bone morphogenetic proteins, or BMPs. And so it modulates the signals in order to cause the bones to produce more mass.
Oh, I see. So it's like working on a kind of the meta level of the.
Yes,
yeah.
But inside our body, a lot of stuff, that the metabolic processes, the way that cells talk to each other is through signaling.
Which kind of makes sense. It's funny if you think about all these things in terms of the visionary experience associated with ayahuasca, where you're in this sort of universe of like myriad signals and different entities and points of view and perspectives, and you're sort of like in this I don't want to call it the internet because the internet's so lame in a lot of ways, but it's it's a very rich informational space. And sometimes when I think about that stuff, I go, how much of this is just the way that our imaginations are translating because of the particular visionary capacity of these compounds, but our imaginations are just translating what's actually happening on a metabolic level. Like we're starting to, it's not another world, another fantastic world of creatures and demons and angels, even though we see those things sometimes. But really what we're doing is it's kind of like an interface to grok the metabolic reality of what's happening as our bodies engage these particular compounds and go through their processes and meet each other and signal to each other. So there's something very concrete about the processes that inspire even the wildest visions.
Well, that of course is the $1 million question. Why these things are neurotransmitters. Okay, things like DMT are very potent neurotransmitters. And what are all these acacia trees doing, and why is it such a common compound in nature? What is the function? And I think when I look at something like harmine anyway, I don't only see one function. I see these simple molecules being extremely polyfunctional, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, are there particularly unusual aspects of harmine as a molecule? Does it just travel widely, or are there things you can say about the its particular character as a molecule?
It's like DMT. It's a very, very simple molecule structurally. One of the interesting things is it's very similar to harmaline, which is also found in ayahuasca, but in much smaller amounts. And although they're structurally so similar, what it seems to me is that even the slightest change in structure can end up in different activity. One of the things that I mentioned in my research is that harmine binds to DNA more than 100 times more efficiently than harmaline. So harmine even has potent genetic effects. And this is interesting in terms of cancer treatment, because, if you can damage DNA of a cancer cell, you can kill it, as long as you don't damage the DNA of the healthy cells. And funny enough, a new paper has shown that, although it's well known that harmine does intercalate very strongly with DNA, a new paper has shown that its anti-cancer effects seem to not be through this DNA intercalation, but it has other ways of causing programmed cell death in certain kinds of cancers.
Do lots of things intercalate with DNA that way? That's one thing I've always wondered. You know, you hear that and you go, "Wow, that's so amazing." You go like, "Well, but maybe a lot of stuff does that." What are the kinds of things that do that?
Not a lot of things intercalate with DNA as strongly as harmine. Now, normally when something does intercalate with DNA, it's normally throws warning lights to look for toxicity, because, you know, if something damages the DNA of a cell and that cell survives and divides, that's what cancer is. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Now, basically, things that intercalate with DNA are known as genotoxins, you know, because they can damage DNA. Now, some things that intercalate with DNA are genotoxic, but they're also mutagens. They cause the change in the DNA, and if that cell then divides, that causes cancer. So not all things that are genotoxic are mutagenic. And harmine is one of those, because, you know, loads of people all over the world drink ayahuasca. And if it was a genotoxic agent, you know, we would all have cancer by now. But harmine is quite unique and special in this regard, in that it is something that intercalates with DNA very, very strongly and doesn't seem to cause cancer. On the contrary, it seems to, well, it already has research in several different kinds of cancers.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, one thing you mentioned earlier was depression as well. Is there any, you know, and I know that people have done a number of research projects showing antidepressive effects of ayahuasca for people with clinical depression, and there clearly seems to be a theme of psychedelics and their capacity to, you know, reboot people, and, you know, you can talk about that on a cognitive level, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of the specific dynamics of harmine, are there some ideas about why harmine might be involved in these antidepressant effects, how it might be functioning in the system, what's it actually doing on a neurological level?
Yes, well, it's there are two alkaloids in ayahuasca that clearly have strong effects in terms of being an antidepressant. One of them is tetrahydroharmine, and the other one is harmine. So on the one hand, you know, harmine and tetrahydroharmine are monoamino oxidase inhibitors, and if you inhibit monoamino oxidase, you allow your serotonin levels to build. But what is very, very interesting about harmine and harmaline is that the longer you take them, the more sensitive you become to them, meaning that, you know, these compounds are also quite uniquely create what is known as reverse tolerance. So meaning that if you were to start taking harmine as an antidepressant, the longer you took it, the less you would have to take to get the same effect. And so I think it's a particularly good antidepressant because it kind of weans you off itself, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that is really remarkable. What do you think is going to come out of this? I mean, is it going to revise people's view of ayahuasca? I mean, I think I remember hearing you say once that after doing all the studies of harmine, that you would drink the rather bitter brew, even if it didn't have any visionary effects. You know, you're like, I just take this.
I would, because if I look at how many of these, you know, how many areas of medicine harmine could potentially show value in. and specifically in areas of medicine, that we have problems with. On the neurological effects, it was discovered a couple of years ago that, harmine causes neurogenesis, both harmine and tetrahydroharmine. Well, in all these neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Huntington's and Parkinson's, which we are really challenged with in Western medicine, something that can produce a lot of neurogenesis is extremely valuable. To take something like ayahuasca regularly, very possibly protects you against very certain kinds of cancers. All these things that normally degenerate with us in age. It seems like harmine causes the outgrowth of certain kinds of tissues that normally degenerate in all of us with age. And these are things like our nervous tissue, our neurons, our joints, our bones, our pancreatic beta cells. And so at the same time, I see that harmine has these very broad spectrum effects in terms of cancer cells, the bad cells. It has these very broad spectrum anti-parasitic effects, and it has research to show that it can kill many, many parasites that, again, in the West, we have some difficulty treating, or we treat with some toxicity. So my feeling is that if you take something like ayahuasca regularly, or you take harmine regularly, what it does is it kills off all these bad guys, all these bad cells and parasites, that all of us accumulate and get. And all these cells that degenerate in all of us with age, it causes the outgrowth of those kind of tissues, which is a very interesting thing. There hasn't been much study, but many people have spoken about the anti-aging effects of ayahuasca. And if you look at traditional populations, you can certainly see that there seems to be a correlation between indigenous people that use ayahuasca regularly and their normal degrees with which they age.
That's very very interesting observation. It seems like there's many dimensions to this marvelous brew, again, beyond the visionary ones that so capture the Western imagination. But we're going to have to stop there, Dale. So I know we could keep talking and learning more from you. I always love learning from you, and just want to thank you again for coming on Expanding Mind and talking about your research.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, great, folks. Until next week, keep your minds open.